Hey there, Dr. Anderson back. I've got some more records I want to talk about, but today I particularly want to talk about Kraftwerk um, because on May 6th, Florian Schneider, one of the two founding members of the band from Dusseldorf, Germany, passed away. He was 73 and he hadn't performed with the band since the mid 2000s. So they had actually planned on touring in the United States before the virus hit this summer, and they were going to do a few shows at major cities. But it seems like with his passing, it's the passing of the band, but not the spirit of the band. So they may still come back. And I want to talk about their records because they were so influential, but so many people in the United States who are not, who are not fans of electronic dance music, don't really know them very well. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm part of the reason. Admittedly, I'm a rock guy. I've always loved acts with lots of guitars and blues based rock. I'm a big REM replacements fan from the '80s. I always loved Zeppelin and things like that from the '70s. I'm a big Beatles fan, Stones fan, all the usual suspects. But I also loved electronics dance acts, particularly those in the '80s and '90s that I got into. Bands like New Order, the Pet Shop Boys, love the Pet Shop Boys and Depeche Mode. I also loved electro funk acts like mid '80s Midnight Star, Nucleus, and experimental pop acts like Bjork. And I also loved hip hop and particularly old school hip hop. And if you're a fan of Kraftwerk, um, or a fan of hip hop, you love Kraftwerk by default. You don't know it, but you do. Grandmaster Flash and African Bambaataa, one of the two founding figures of hip hop, uh, sampled and utilized a significant amount of Kraftwerk. Bambaataa sampled Trans Europe Express for Planet Rock, and I'll talk more about that record later. Um, what's really interesting about this act is that they're not guitar based at all. There's no guitars on it. At least on their later records, the earlier records a bit. Uh, and all these acts, like all these hip hop and electronic acts that really weren't guitar based, would always acknowledge it and continue to acknowledge a deep debt to Kraftwerk. Um, so why doesn't the U.S. understand them? And there are a lot of reasons for this. So as I mentioned before, they're not blues based rock. And when you talk about rock in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it really comes down to blues based figures. If you're a guitarist, first thing that you learn is as a blues change. You learn a 1-4-5. If you are playing in a if you're playing guitar at all, you often the first things you learn are minor pentatonics. If you play country, it's a lot of blues based affiliations there. Um, and Americans really look towards the blues as a sort of past. It's always looked back to its roots. It's always been focusing backwards. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a sort of exploration of what was lost. And that's true of folk music. That's true, folk music records in the 1950s and 60s. An act like Dylan is key to this of trying to find that, what Groucho Marcus called that old weird America. But German music after the war, after World War II, is not roots oriented. Kraftwerk, like many other German acts of the day in the 1960s and 70s, like Can, Popol Vuh, Klusta, Neu, and many others, Harmonia, um, they're decidedly looking towards a future that gets away from the trauma of World War II. And they're, in fact, not looking towards a past because it was in looking towards that past, a sort of mythical past of Germany, that was one of the precepts of the rise of National Socialism. And so these acts that I mentioned, like I said, like in Kraftwerk being one of them, is particularly trying to aim towards a new future, something much more utopian that comes out of a devastated Germany. All these guys are born right after the war. And Florian himself is born right after the war ends, and there's devastation. There's literally people whose jobs is just to collect brick. This is not a time of celebration. So Kraftwerk emerges out of this, and they come out in the 1960s, and like a lot of people in the 1960s, they're influenced by the experimentation of the time. Sometimes the Beatles, but they have their own experimentation. People like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who's working with electronic music in a sort of classical vein. And Florian himself is a trained flautist and performs in a gymnasium in classical orchestras. And you can hear it on the first two records, Kraftwerk 1 and Kraftwerk 2, where he plays a lot of flute. In fact, he does this later on in Autobahn, which I'll talk about in just a bit. But those two records are often not thought of as the key records. They're good records, they're interesting records, but they're not the key records. The main five records are these: Autobahn, okay? We'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. Trans-Europe Express, which people often consider, a lot of people consider their most beautiful record. I think it is gorgeous. Um, Man Machine, which has robots, and the model, which the model is covered later on by a number of bands, including Chicago's Big Black. My favorite, Computer World, which I'll talk about later. I couldn't find my vinyl copy, but I do have a CD. And Electric Cafe, which comes out at the end of the 80s. They did many. They've done some more records, obviously more albums, but those are the main five for me. And and another reason why people don't know these records very well, I mean, lots of fans of electronic dance music do, but the general public doesn't, is they never had any hits in the States. And I think it's one of those things when you think about Kraftwerk, um, there's no hummable tune that you remember. There's nothing that's played on oldies radio, which is a touchstone for so many Americans. It just doesn't exist. So let's talk about Kraftwerk in these records, because Kraftwerk is really fascinating in just one sense, and it'll bring us to Autobahn and Computer World. Uh, Kraftwerk gets a bad rap because one of the big criticisms of them is that they're robotic. They have an over reliance on sequencers. They have an over reliance on computers, particularly in their later work. But I don't think this is true. I think, in fact, what they see is the soulful potential of technology, even robotic technology. These records are really beautiful. Even though these records, these acts became or Kraftwerk became sort of a joke um, about robots. I mean, Ferguson had whole segments on his talk show about about Kraftwerk, where that he imitated actually Florian Schneider, and in his bandmate would be imitated by somebody else, and they would exchange Christmas gifts and make really despondent, funny jokes. Um, these they're actually really beautiful records if you take them for what they are. And the albums are not soulless; they're anything but soulless. They have a belief in a power of the future, a future that we've not conceived of yet. And I think this is one of the reasons why there's such a huge influence on electronic dance music, because electronic dance music and the festivals that often accompany it are those spaces. They generate spaces that completely embrace a science fantastic, a utopia where technologies allow us to become more human and freer and more open to what that could mean. And this is one of the lessons of all things Autobahn. So Autobahn itself, you can see here the technology of the highway, which is a modern 20th century technology, and driving, right? The the driving and just in general is a 20th century phenomenon. And where you're traveling to, well, who knows? But you can travel. In fact, these records like Trans-Europe Express and Autobahn, they're obsessed with movement and travel, the possibility of going someplace. And Autobahn itself, what's fascinating about Autobahn is the cut itself, Autobahn, is 22 minutes long. It's a 22-minute track, and it just meanders. It has this hypnotic quality that's brought about by a belief in just repetition and variations on it. It's gorgeous. It has its own life. In fact, when Florian passed on May 6th, BBC Six played the entire cut, which is something you would never hear in the United States, maybe in college radio. But here you have a national network streaming globally all 22 minutes of Autobahn. Um, and that's really, one of the fundamental beliefs here is that technology can move us. It has a liberating potential. And the roads of the future, like I said, will allow you to travel everywhere. And and for that, early on in 1984, they released my favorite record, which is Computer World. Uh, this is easily their most accessible record. It's the one that you can quite simply get into quicker than others. Again, in the U.S., it was not considered a great record. A lot of people did not embrace this, but it's pretty clear that at this time that they're doing something very different. If you look at the back cover here, the band members have literally depicting themselves as robots. So, all those acts that have embraced sequencers, that have embraced synthetic technologies, are actually shown that you know it's all synthetic technologies, amplifiers, everything, but really embrace the synthesizer and these sounds that are not based out of you know anything a legacy of acoustic instruments. Those acts owe a huge debt to Kraftwerk, and they know it. And I hope that if you're interested in this, you'll go and check out the YouTube playlist that I've made of Kraftwerk, some people talking. One quick minute here, because I do want to mention one thing about the liberating effects of technology. And this is just a quick aside. On Trans Europe Express, which was, like I said, sampled by Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash once said about the cut Trans Europe Express that this was funky in a way that he'd never heard before. So here he is in the Bronx, cross cutting between this track, and he said this cut, because of its length, allowed him to do things that he could never do before, like go to the bathroom while he was DJing, or or go get a soda. The cut itself felt like a hip hop track. It was proto hip hop, and again, hip hop too is looking towards the future, and it's future oriented. It may be based in reality, but there's something always very hopeful about the sounds of hip hop. Um, Anyways, I've been rambling. I'm really gonna miss Florian's thoughts. I already have because he's really been out of the creative act for a while. But I think we're not going to miss these records because they do work on themselves. They'll continue to persist. They'll continue to play, and people will continue to sample them and continue to grow inspired by them. I hope you get a chance to check some of these out. Take care. Bye bye.